In the unforgiving wilderness of 1847 Wyoming Territory, where the Oregon Trail carved its treacherous path through hostile land, moral choices often meant the difference between survival and death for entire wagon trains. Jacob Mitchell had led 43 families safely across 2,000 miles of prairie, desert, and mountain passes, earning respect as one of the most reliable wagon masters on the frontier. His reputation was built on making hard decisions that kept the majority alive, even when those decisions haunted his dreams. But on a bitter October morning, with winter storms threatening and supplies running dangerously low, Jacob would face a choice that would strip away everything he believed about himself as a man, a leader, and a father. Hidden beneath a pile of buffalo robes in the back of his own wagon lay a secret that could destroy his authority and doom the entire train to starvation in the coming snows. The secret had a name, Hope Mitchell, and she was about to change everything. Anyone thought they knew about what it meant to be human. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pre-dawn darkness of October 15th, 1847, pressed against the canvas walls of 47 wagons, arranged in their protective circle on the high plains of what would someday become southeastern Wyoming. Inside the largest wagon, positioned strategically at the circle's center where the wagon master could respond quickly to any threat, Jacob Mitchell sat hunched over a hand-drawn map that had guided countless trains before his own. The flickering light of a whale oil lamp cast dancing shadows across his weathered face, highlighting worry lines that had deepened considerably over the past month. At 34, Jacob carried himself with the quiet authority that came from making life-and-death decisions for nearly 200 people every single day. His broad shoulders bore the weight of leadership that had transformed him from an optimistic young farmer into a man who calculated human survival in terms of wagon weights, food rations, and the increasingly treacherous mountain passes that lay ahead. The Oregon Trail had no mercy for sentimentality, and Jacob had learned to bury his softer instincts beneath layers of practical necessity. His fingers traced the route ahead, measuring distances between water sources and counting the days until the mountain snows would make travel impossible. They were behind schedule, dangerously behind. The late start from Independence, Missouri, followed by 3 weeks lost to a cholera outbreak that had claimed 8 lives, meant they were racing winter to reach the safety of Oregon's Willamette Valley. Every decision now carried the potential for catastrophe. Morning, Jacob. The voice belonged to Thomas Bradley, his second in command and the closest thing to a friend that Jacob allowed himself on the trail. Thomas ducked through the wagon's canvas opening, his graying beard already stiff with frost from the October air. Weather's turning. Could see our breath when we checked the livestock. Jacob nodded without looking up from his calculations. How are the Hendersons holding up? The Henderson family had lost their youngest son to cholera 2 weeks earlier, and grief had a way of making the trail even more dangerous when people stopped paying attention to essential survival tasks. Martha's still not eating regular, Thomas replied, settling onto a wooden crate that served as the wagon's only extra seating. But Samuel's taking up the slack, keeping their wagon maintained and helping with their oxen. That boy's grown up considerable these past weeks. Thomas paused, studying Jacob's expression in the lamplight. You look like hell, my friend. When's the last time you slept more than 2 hours straight? The question hit closer to home than Thomas could have known. Jacob's sleepless nights weren't entirely due to the responsibilities of wagon master, though those were burden enough. For the past 3 weeks, since the night his wife Sarah had nearly died giving birth in the back of this very wagon, Jacob had been living with a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. Sleep's a luxury we can't afford, Jacob said, deflecting Thomas's concern with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to keep private struggles hidden. We've got maybe 6 weeks before the mountain passes become impassable. At our current pace, we'll be cutting it close even if we don't lose any more time to illness or breakdowns. Thomas leaned forward, lowering his voice even though they were alone. There's been talk among some of the families about lightning loads again. The Williamses are willing to abandon their piano, and several others are considering leaving behind non-essential furniture and supplies. Might give us a few extra miles per day if the wagons aren't carrying so much weight. Jacob appreciated Thomas's diplomatic phrasing. Talk among the families usually meant complaints that eventually made their way to the wagon master when people's fears outweighed their patience. The decision to abandon precious belongings was never easy. These items represented not just monetary value but connections to the lives people had left behind in pursuit of Oregon's promised opportunities. Set up a meeting for tonight after supper, Jacob decided. We'll go wagon by wagon and assess what can be spared. But Thomas, he looked up from his map, meeting his friend's concerned gaze. Make it clear that this isn't optional anymore. Winter doesn't negotiate, and neither can we. The two men sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the challenges ahead. Thomas had been making this journey for 5 years, guiding families west with the same combination of hope and desperation that had driven westward expansion since the Louisiana Purchase. He understood the mathematics of survival as well as Jacob did. Too many people, too little time, too many variables that could turn deadly without warning. A soft sound from the back of the wagon broke the silence. Thomas glanced toward the canvas partition that separated the main wagon space from Jacob's family's private quarters, his expression curious. Sarah feeling better this morning? Haven't seen her around the campfire much lately. Jacob's hand stilled on the map, every muscle in his body tensing at the innocent question. She's still recovering. Birth was harder than expected. The words were technically true, but they carried only a fraction of the real story. Sarah had indeed barely survived the delivery, losing so much blood that Jacob had prepared himself for widowhood while Dr. Marcus Williams worked frantically to save her life. But Sarah's physical recovery, miraculous as it had been, paled in comparison to the emotional devastation that had followed when she first saw their daughter. Give her my regards, Thomas said, rising to begin his morning rounds. And Jacob? Consider taking your own advice about that meeting tonight. There are things that can't be carried alone, even by wagon masters. After Thomas left, Jacob remained hunched over his map, but his eyes no longer focused on the carefully marked distances and landmarks. Instead, his vision turned inward to the memory of 3 weeks ago, when Dr. Williams had placed a tiny, squirming bundle in his arms, and his world had shifted on its axis in ways that had nothing to do with joy. The baby his daughter had been born with what Dr. Williams clinically described as severe physical deformities. Her left arm ended just below the elbow, a smooth stump where a hand should have been. Her right leg was visibly shorter than her left, twisted in a way that would make walking impossible. Most disturbing to Jacob's frontier sensibilities, her face bore a distinctive birthmark that covered nearly half of her features in deep purple, making her appearance startling to anyone who saw her for the first time. In the civilized world they had left behind in Missouri, such children might find care in specialized institutions or live protected lives within understanding families. But on the Oregon Trail, where every member of a community needed to contribute to survival, where resources were measured in ounces and every decision was filtered through the lens of group welfare, a disabled child represented something far more complicated than personal tragedy. The sound came again from behind the canvas partition, a soft cooing that might have been mistaken for contentment, if Jacob hadn't known better. His daughter was awake, and soon Sarah would be as well, beginning another day of the silent suffering that had defined their marriage since the birth. Jacob had named the child Hope. During those first few hours when adrenaline and relief at Sarah's survival had overwhelmed his practical concerns, the name had seemed appropriate then, representing their gratitude for Sarah's life and their future in Oregon. Now 3 weeks later, the name felt like a cruel joke. Hope for what? For a child who would never be able to contribute to the harsh realities of frontier life. For parents who would be forever burdened with care that could compromise the welfare of everyone depending on Jacob's leadership. The ethical calculations that had seemed clear in those first few days had become increasingly complex as Jacob watched his wife retreat into a grief so profound that she barely acknowledged the child's existence. Sarah, who had dreamed of motherhood throughout their 5-year marriage, couldn't bring herself to hold or feed their daughter. The responsibility had fallen to Jacob, who managed nighttime feedings and diaper changes with the same grim efficiency he brought to all unpleasant necessities, but the practical challenges of caring for a disabled infant while leading a wagon train were nothing compared to the social dynamics that Jacob could feel shifting around him like autumn weather patterns. Whispered conversations stopped when he approached groups of settlers. Concerned glances followed him during the daily briefings where he outlined route decisions and safety protocols. People were beginning to ask questions about Sarah's continued absence from communal activities, and soon those questions would extend to the child they had heard crying but never seen. The truth was that Jacob had been hiding Hope's existence from the rest of the wagon train since her birth. The official story was that Sarah had miscarried and was still recovering from the physical and emotional trauma. It was a lie that served multiple purposes. It protected Sarah from having to explain her inability to care for their child. It prevented the kind of community discussion that could undermine confidence in Jacob's leadership. And it bought time for Jacob to figure out what to do with a daughter who represented everything the frontier couldn't accommodate. Dr. Williams knew the truth. Of course, having attended the birth and provided what medical care he could. But Marcus Williams was a man who understood the complexities of frontier life, and he had agreed to keep the family's privacy while Jacob and Sarah adjusted to their new circumstances. The doctor's discretion was motivated by genuine compassion, but Jacob knew it couldn't last indefinitely. Eventually, questions would be asked that couldn't be answered with vague references to miscarriage and recovery. The morning routine began around Jacob as the wagon train stirred to life with the familiar sounds of families preparing for another day's journey. Oxen lowed as they were yoked to wagons. Children's voices carried across the camp circle as they helped with daily chores, and the scent of wood smoke and bacon began to mix with the crisp autumn air. These were the sounds and smells of community, of people working together toward common goals despite individual hardships. But for the first time in his 5 years as a wagon master, Jacob felt disconnected from the community he was supposed to lead. The secret he carried created a barrier between him and the families who trusted him with their lives, and that barrier was becoming more difficult to maintain with each passing day. Gentle knock on the wagon's tailgate interrupted his brooding. "Jacob, you in there?" The voice belonged to Martha Henderson, the woman who had lost her young son to cholera, and who had become something of a maternal figure to the entire wagon train's children. "Morning, Martha," Jacob called back, quickly, folding his map and moving toward the wagon's entrance. Martha Henderson was exactly the kind of person who would notice details that others might miss, and her offer to help with anything the Mitchell family might need had been both generous and concerning. "Brought you some fresh biscuits," Martha sighed, holding up a cloth-wrapped bundle that smelled like heaven after weeks of trail rations. Figured Sarah might appreciate something that doesn't come from a tin or a sack. Her eyes searched Jacob's face with the keen attention of someone who had raised 6 children and could read adult distress as easily as a child's fever. "That's very thoughtful," Jacob replied, accepting the warm bundle. "Sarah's still. It's been difficult." Martha nodded with the understanding of someone who had experienced her own share of loss. "Grief has its own timeline, Jacob. Can't be rushed or reasoned with. But sometimes company helps, even when we think we want to be alone." She paused, her expression becoming more direct. I could sit with her this afternoon if you think she'd welcome the visit. Sometimes women need to talk to other women about things that men can't understand. The offer was kindly meant, but it sent a spike of anxiety through Jacob's chest. Martha Henderson's maternal instincts were legendary on the trail. She had helped deliver 2 babies during their journey and had provided nursing care during the cholera outbreak. If anyone would immediately recognize that Sarah hadn't miscarried, it would be Martha. I appreciate the offer, Jacob said carefully, but Sarah's asked for privacy while she recovers. Maybe in a few more days when she's feeling stronger. Martha's expression didn't change, but Jacob caught a flicker of something concern, perhaps, or the kind of intuitive suspicion that experienced mothers developed about situations that didn't quite make sense. Of course, she said simply. You know where to find me if anything changes. As Martha walked away, Jacob understood that his carefully constructed deception was beginning to show cracks that couldn't be hidden much longer. The frontier community was too small, too interconnected, and too dependent on mutual support for major secrets to remain buried indefinitely. Soon, very soon, he would have to make a decision about Hope's future that went far beyond daily care and feeding. The map in his hands showed the route to Oregon, but it couldn't chart a course through the moral wilderness that lay ahead. Terrain where love, duty, and survival intersected in ways that had no clear pathways or reliable landmarks. Jacob Mitchell, who had guided dozens of families safely across 2,000 miles of dangerous territory, was about to discover that the most treacherous part of any journey was the distance between what a man believed about himself and what he was actually capable of doing when everything he valued was at stake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the temporary camp as Jacob made his rounds, checking wagon repairs and consulting with families about the evening's difficult decisions regarding abandoned belongings. The Henderson wagon sat slightly apart from the others, its occupants still processing their recent loss in the quiet way that grief demanded. Samuel Henderson, now the man of his family at barely 16, was methodically checking wheel spokes with the thoroughness his father had taught him before pneumonia claimed him in Kansas. Afternoon, Samuel, Jacob said, approaching the young man who had aged years in the span of weeks. How are those rear wheels holding up? Samuel looked up from his work, his face bearing the premature seriousness that frontier hardship carved into children who had no choice but to become adults overnight. Found some cracking in the left rear hub, Mr. Mitchell. Nothing that'll fail today, but it won't make it over the mountains without attention. Jacob knelt beside the wheel, running his fingers along the wood grain to assess the damage. Samuel was right, the crack was hairline now, but mountain terrain would turn it into a catastrophic failure that could cost them days they didn't have. We'll need to reinforce it with iron bands from the spare hardware. Think you can handle that kind of repair? Yes, sir. Pa taught me before. Samuel's voice caught slightly, but he pushed through with the determination that had kept his family functioning. Before he passed, Ma's got the measurements for the band somewhere in her recipes box. It was exactly this kind of practical knowledge transfer that made frontier families functional units, fathers teaching sons, mothers teaching daughters, each generation building on the survival skills that had brought them this far. Jacob found himself wondering what skills he would have taught a son, what knowledge he could pass down to ensure the next generation's success in Oregon's promised valleys. But Hope would never learn wagon repair or livestock management. She would never contribute to the essential tasks that define frontier life. The thought struck him with fresh pain, followed immediately by guilt at his own selfishness. What kind of father measured his child's worth by her potential economic contribution to family survival? I'll send Thomas over with the hardware after supper, Jacob promised Samuel. And Samuel, you're doing right by your family. Your father would be proud. The boy's shoulders straightened with pride that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. At 16, Samuel Henderson was successfully filling a role that most grown men found challenging. Driven by love for his mother and sisters and a sense of responsibility that came from understanding what was at stake. Jacob continued his circuit of the wagons, each stop revealing another layer of the complex social dynamics that held their traveling community together. The Williams family was debating whether to abandon their collection of medical books, valuable knowledge that Dr. Williams insisted could save lives in Oregon, but heavy enough to slow their oxen's already labored pace. The Patterson family had decided to leave behind their grandmother's china cabinet, a decision that left Mrs. Patterson quietly weeping as she wrapped each piece for storage until they could somehow retrieve it later. These were the daily sacrifices that the trail demanded, pieces of identity and heritage abandoned in service of survival. Jacob understood the mathematics of such decisions, but watching families dismantle their past to secure their future never became easier. As evening approached and cooking fires began to dot the wagon circle, Jacob found himself dreading the return to his own wagon, where Sarah waited in a silence that had become as much a part of their daily routine as morning coffee and evening prayers. For 3 weeks, she had spoken only when absolutely necessary, her responses to his attempts at conversation consisting of nods, single-word answers, and the kind of polite distance that hurt worse than open anger, the canvas partition that separated their living space from the wagon's front section might as well have been a canyon for all the emotional distance it represented. Sarah spent her days lying on their makeshift bed, staring at the wagon's curved ceiling with eyes that seemed to be seeing something far beyond the immediate reality of their circumstances. She ate the food Jacob brought her, performed necessary personal care, and maintained the basic functions of survival. But the vibrant woman he had married seemed to have disappeared entirely. Hope, meanwhile, continued to exist in the strange liminal space between acknowledgement and denial. During daylight hours, when the sounds of camp activity might cover her cries, Jacob managed her care with mechanical efficiency. Feeding, changing, the basic maintenance of infant life that he had never expected to handle alone. At night, when her sounds might carry to neighboring wagons, he sometimes found himself holding her against his chest for hours, his hand gently covering her mouth during the worst of her crying fits. The deception was destroying him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not just the practical exhaustion of managing secret childcare while maintaining his leadership responsibilities, but the deeper spiritual toll of denying his daughter's existence to the community that depended on his honesty and judgment. Jacob? Dr. Marcus Williams approached as Jacob stood outside his wagon, gathering courage for another evening of domestic pretense. Wondered if I might have a word about tomorrow's route. Marcus Williams was a godsend on the trail-trained physician who had given up a comfortable Boston practice to seek new opportunities in Oregon's growing settlements. His medical knowledge had saved lives during their cholera outbreak, and his calm demeanor during crises had made him invaluable as both healer and counselor to families dealing with loss and hardship. Marcus also knew the truth about hope, and Jacob could see in the doctor's eyes the same concern that had been growing for weeks as he witnessed the Mitchell family's isolation and dysfunction. Of course, Jacob replied, though he suspected this conversation would have little to do with route planning. What's on your mind? Marcus glanced around the camp circle, noting the families gathered around their evening fires, children playing between the wagons while parents discussed the day's challenges and tomorrow's plans. Beautiful sight, isn't it? All these separate families becoming something larger than themselves through shared purpose and mutual dependence. Jacob nodded, unsure where Marcus was leading the conversation, but recognizing the doctor's tendency to approach difficult topics through philosophical observation rather than direct confrontation. I've been thinking about community, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the thoughtful cadence of someone who had spent considerable time pondering complex questions. About what holds groups of people together when everything else tries to tear them apart. Fear, exhaustion, loss, the constant pressure of making decisions that could mean life or death for everyone involved. It's trust, Jacob said without hesitation. Trust that everyone's pulling in the same direction, that no one's hiding anything that could compromise the group's welfare. Marcus met Jacob's eyes with an expression that was both gentle and unflinching. Exactly, trust, which is why I'm concerned about a situation that's been weighing on my mind for several weeks now. Jacob felt his stomach drop, understanding that the moment he'd been dreading was finally arriving. The careful deception that had bought him 3 weeks of avoidance was about to crumble under the scrutiny of someone who cared enough to ask difficult questions. Marcus, if this is about Sarah, this is about all of you, Marcus interrupted gently. Sarah, you and the daughter whose existence you've been hiding from people who consider you family. The words hung in the evening, air like smoke from the cooking fires, heavy with implications that Jacob wasn't ready to face. Around them, the normal sounds of camp life continued, children laughing, adults discussing the day's events, oxen shifting restlessly in their makeshift corral. Life proceeding with the assumption that tomorrow would bring challenges they could meet together as a community. She's not ... Jacob began, then stopped, realizing that any explanation would only dig him deeper into deception. The situation is complicated. I'm sure it is, Marcus said, with the patience of someone accustomed to helping people work through problems they couldn't solve alone. Complicated enough that you've been carrying the burden of caring for an infant while leading this wagon train. Complicated enough that Sarah has withdrawn from everyone who might offer support. Complicated enough that you're both suffering in isolation when you could be receiving help from people who care about your family. Jacob looked toward his wagon, where Hope was probably stirring from her afternoon nap and would soon need feeding. The routine that had become second nature: heating milk, preparing makeshift bottles, managing diaper changes and clothing adjustments, while keeping everything quiet enough not to attract attention. The exhaustion of maintaining such deception, while making daily decisions that affected nearly 200 lives. You don't understand the position I'm in, Jacob said finally. These people depend on me to make decisions based on what's best for everyone. If they knew about Hope, about her condition, ... double quotes, what about her condition? Marcus asked, his professional demeanor sharpening with genuine curiosity. That she was born with physical differences that don't conform to your expectations of what children should look like. That she requires care and attention like every other infant on this train? She's not like every other infant, Jacob snapped, his carefully controlled emotions finally breaking through. She'll never be able to contribute to family survival, never be able to work or marry or live independently. In Oregon, she'd be nothing but a burden on people who can't afford to carry dead weight. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Jacob's face with the clinical attention he brought to diagnosing illness. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not the gentle counseling tone he'd been using, but something harder and more direct. Jacob, I've delivered hundreds of babies in my career. I've seen children born with every conceivable variation of human development, and I've watched families respond to those differences in ways that revealed everything about their character and values. He paused, his eyes never leaving Jacob's face. What I see in your situation isn't a child who can't contribute to family welfare. What I see is a father who's so afraid of what other people might think that he's willing to deny his daughter's existence rather than discover what she might actually be capable of. The accusation hit Jacob like a physical blow, partly because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Was his concern really about Hope's welfare and the wagon train's survival? Or was it about his own reputation, his own fear of being seen as weak or burdened by circumstances beyond his control? You think I don't love her? Jacob asked, his voice rough with emotion he'd been suppressing for weeks. You think this is easy for me? "I think you love her enough to sacrifice your own sleep and health to care for her," Marcus replied immediately. "I think you love her enough to carry a secret that's tearing you apart, rather than risk exposing her to judgment or rejection." But Jacob, love that isolates and hides isn't the same as love that protects and nurtures. Before Jacob could respond, a commotion near the Patterson wagon drew their attention. Mrs. Patterson was calling for Dr. Williams, her voice carrying the edge of panic that every parent on the trail learned to recognize. Marcus immediately excused himself and hurried toward the disturbance, leaving Jacob alone with thoughts that refused to settle into comfortable certainty. As he watched Marcus tend to whatever medical crisis had emerged, Jacob realized that their conversation had crystallized something he'd been avoiding for weeks. The question wasn't whether Hope could survive the trail or contribute to frontier life. The question was whether Jacob Mitchell, respected wagon master and community leader, had the courage to trust his community with the truth about his family. Inside his wagon, Hope began to cry the soft, persistent sound that had become the soundtrack to his secret guilt and growing desperation. Tomorrow they would reach the river crossing that represented their last chance to make significant time before the mountain passes. Tomorrow, decisions would have to be made about route choices, supply management, and the final push toward Oregon. That would determine whether they all survived the winter. But tonight, Jacob had to decide whether he would continue living the lie that was slowly destroying his family, or find the courage to trust the community he'd been protecting from the truth about what love looked like when it wore an unexpected face. The choice was becoming as inevitable as the approaching winter, and just as unforgiving for anyone unprepared to face its harsh realities. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the wagon train on October 16th, bringing with it the kind of heavy sky that promised early snow and the urgent reminder that winter waited for no one on the high plains. Jacob had spent the night in fitful sleep, his dreams haunted by conversations with Dr. Williams and the growing weight of decisions that could no longer be postponed. The morning air carried a bite that made every breath visible and sent families scrambling to add extra layers beneath their traveling clothes. The river crossing lay 8 miles ahead, the Sweetwater River at a point where spring snowmelt and autumn rains had swollen the normally manageable ford into something that would test both courage and engineering skills. Jacob had crossed here twice before in previous years, but never this late in the season and never with water running as high and fast as the advance scouts were reporting. "Water's up to the wagon beds at the deepest point," reported James Patterson, who had ridden ahead with 2 other men to assess the crossing conditions. "Currents strong enough to push a wagon sideways if the oxen lose their footing. We'll need to double-team the heavier loads and rope the wagons together for stability." Jacob studied the hand-drawn map that Patterson had sketched of the river bottom, noting the locations of submerged rocks and the shifting sandbar that created the only practical ford for miles in either direction. This crossing would require every family to contribute their strongest oxen and most experienced drivers, working together with the kind of coordinated effort that had kept them alive across 2,000 miles of hostile territory. "How long to get everyone across?" Jacob asked, though he already suspected the answer would complicate their timeline significantly. "Best case, if we start immediately and have no major problems, we're looking at 6 hours, Patterson replied. "More likely 8 to 10 hours, assuming we don't lose any wagons to mechanical failure or livestock injuries. 10 hours to move 47 wagons across a swollen river, with winter storms threatening and mountain passes that would close within weeks." Jacob felt the familiar weight of leadership settling heavier on his shoulders as he calculated the risks and alternatives that would determine whether nearly 200 people lived to see Oregon's promised valleys. But even as he planned of technical aspects of the river crossing, Jacob's mind kept returning to Hope's quiet presence in the wagon behind him and the conversation with Dr. Williams that had shattered his comfortable illusions about the sustainability of his deception. Today, with families working in close proximity and emergency situations that might require opening every wagon for inspection and modification, maintaining the secret of Hope's existence would become nearly impossible. Thomas, Jacob called to his second-in-command, who was organizing the advance teams that would mark the safest route across the river bottom. "I need to discuss something with you, something important." Thomas Bradley approached with the steady confidence that had made him invaluable as Jacob's right hand throughout their journey. At 42, he possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from raising 4 children while operating a successful farm in Missouri, and his judgment in crisis situations had earned respect from every family on the train. "What's troubling you, Jacob? You've had the look of a man wrestling with something bigger than route planning for weeks now." The observation was more perceptive than Jacob had realized anyone noticed, but Thomas had always possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that complemented Jacob's more technical leadership skills. If anyone in the wagon train could handle the truth about his family situation, it would be Thomas Bradley. "Walk with me," Jacob said, gesturing toward a cluster of cottonwood trees that would provide privacy from the bustling activity of families preparing for the river crossing. "What I need to tell you can't be overheard by anyone else." They walked in silence until they reached the trees, where Jacob found himself staring at the rushing water of the Sweetwater River while struggling to find words for a confession that felt both inevitable and impossible. How did a man admit that he had been lying to people who trusted him with their lives? How did he explain that fear had made him choose deception over the honesty that frontier communities depended on for survival? 3 weeks ago, Jacob began, his voice barely audible over the sound of rushing water. When Sarah had her complications during childbirth, Dr. Williams saved more than just her life. Thomas waited patiently, his expression growing more serious, as he recognized the gravity of whatever Jacob was preparing to reveal. "Sarah didn't miscarry," Jacob continued, the words coming easier now that he had begun. "She gave birth to a daughter. A living daughter who's been in our wagon every day since we left the last camping spot." Thomas's eyebrows rose with surprise, but his expression remained carefully neutral as he processed this information. "A daughter," he repeated slowly. "Jacob, that's wonderful news. Why would you keep such a blessing secret from people who consider themselves family?" The question contained exactly the kind of innocent assumption that Jacob had been dreading, the expectation that all children were automatically blessings, that birth was always cause for celebration, regardless of circumstances or complications. "Because she's not." Jacob struggled with the words, hating himself for the implications of what he was about to say. "She was born with significant physical deformities. Her left arm ends at the elbow, her right leg is twisted and shortened, and her face bears a large birthmark that covers nearly half her features." Thomas absorbed this information without visible reaction, his farming background having provided experience with livestock births that didn't always result in perfect specimens. But Jacob could see him processing the implications for human survival in frontier conditions where physical capability often determined family welfare. "I see," Thomas said carefully. "And you've been concerned about how the community might react to a child with special needs." "I've been concerned about what it means for everyone's survival," Jacob corrected, his defensive tone revealing the internal conflict that had been tearing him apart. "Thomas, we're barely going to make it to Oregon with healthy families contributing everything they have. A child who will never be able to work, never be able to contribute to household survival, represents a burden that could compromise everyone's welfare." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the river current carry fallen leaves downstream with the relentless force that would soon test their wagons and oxen. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not judgment, but the kind of thoughtful consideration that came from deep personal experience. "My youngest brother was born with a clubfoot," Thomas said eventually. Twisted so bad the local doctor said he'd never walk properly, never be able to work the farm. Like the rest of us boys. My father spent weeks deciding whether to send him away to relatives in the city who might be able to care for him better. Jacob felt a flicker of recognition at this parallel to his own situation, though he wasn't sure whether Thomas was offering understanding or preparing to deliver judgment about his choices. "What did your father decide?" Jacob asked. "He decided that family meant family, regardless of what form it took," Thomas replied immediately. "My brother Samuel learned to walk with a special boot that the town blacksmith made for him. He couldn't do heavy field work, but he became the best bookkeeper and livestock trader in 3 counties. Turned out his disability forced him to develop skills that made him more valuable to the family business than any of us with 2 good legs." The story was meant to be encouraging, Jacob realized, but it also highlighted the difference between settled farming communities with established support systems and the harsh realities of frontier survival where specialized skills mattered less than raw physical capability. "This isn't Missouri, Thomas," Jacob said gently. "We're not talking about a farming community with blacksmiths who can make special boots and customers who need bookkeeping services. We're talking about survival in Oregon Territory, where every family member needs to contribute to basic subsistence." "Are we?" Thomas asked, his tone sharpening slightly. "Or are we talking about your fear of what people might think about Jacob Mitchell having a less than perfect child?" The accusation hit harder coming from Thomas than it had from Dr. Williams, partly because Thomas represented the practical, no-nonsense perspective that Jacob respected most. If Thomas saw his concerns as primarily about reputation rather than survival, then perhaps Jacob's motivations were more selfish than he wanted to admit. Before Jacob could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the wagon circle. Voices were raised in alarm, and Jacob could see people running toward one of the wagons near the perimeter. Both men immediately abandoned their conversation and ran toward the disturbance, their leadership instincts overriding personal concerns. In the face of potential crisis, the commotion centered around the Morrison wagon, where Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison was holding her 2-year-old son, Danny, while Dr. Williams examined the child with obvious concern. Danny's face was flushed with fever, and his breathing was labored in a way that immediately triggered fears of the respiratory illnesses that had claimed lives earlier in their journey. "Started this morning," Mrs. Morrison was explaining to Dr. Williams, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "He was fine yesterday, playing with the other children, eating normally. But he woke up burning with fever and struggling to breathe." Jacob and Thomas joined the circle of concerned families that had gathered around the Morrison wagon, their conversation temporarily forgotten in the face of a medical emergency that could affect the entire wagon train. Childhood illnesses spread quickly in the close quarters of trail life, and respiratory problems were particularly dangerous at high altitude with winter weather. Approaching. Dr. Williams completed his examination with the methodical thoroughness that had earned trust throughout their journey. "It's croup," he announced finally, his diagnosis bringing visible relief to parents who had been fearing something more contagious. "Serious but treatable if we can keep his airways clear and manage the fever." "What does he need?" Mrs. Morrison asked immediately, prepared to do whatever was necessary to save her son's life. "Warm, humid air to ease his breathing," Dr. Williams replied. "Frequent fever reduction with cool cloths, and constant monitoring to ensure his condition doesn't worsen. The next 24 hours will be critical." Jacob felt the familiar weight of leadership decisions settling on his shoulders as he realized the implications of Danny Morrison's illness for their river crossing timeline. A seriously ill child couldn't be moved safely, especially not through the challenging conditions they would face at the swollen ford. But delaying the crossing could mean the difference between reaching Oregon before winter and being trapped in the mountains when the snows came. "How long before we know if he's going to recover?" Jacob asked Dr. Williams, though he suspected. The answer would force him to choose between one child's welfare and the survival chances of nearly 200 people. If we can break the fever and clear his breathing, he should be well enough to travel in 2 or 3 days, Dr. Williams replied. But moving him now, especially through cold river water and the stress of a difficult crossing, could turn a treatable illness into something fatal. 2 or 3 days. Jacob looked at the gray sky that promised snow, calculated the distance to mountain passes that would close within weeks, and felt the crushing weight of decisions that had no good options. Every day they delayed increased the risk of being caught by winter storms that would kill far more people than one child's illness. The gathered families sensed the dilemma without needing explanation. They had all learned to think in terms of group survival versus individual needs, and they understood that frontier life sometimes demanded choices that civilization would never require. But as Jacob looked at Danny Morrison's fevered face and his mother's desperate love, he found himself thinking about hope, hidden in his wagon just a few hundred yards away. Another child whose existence had become a problem, requiring difficult decisions about resources, timing, and the greater good of the community. The parallel was unmistakable, and suddenly Jacob understood that his secret was about to become public in the worst possible way. Because there was no way to care for a seriously ill child in a wagon train without every family contributing whatever they could, and that meant opening his own wagon to inspection, revealing supplies and space that might be needed for Danny Morrison's recovery. The deception that had protected hope for 3 weeks was about to crumble under the weight of community crisis. And Jacob Mitchell was about to discover whether his leadership could survive the revelation that he had been lying to people who trusted him with their lives. The Morrison family crisis transformed the wagon circle into a hive of coordinated activity as every family contributed whatever they could to help a desperately ill child. Mrs. Patterson brought her largest pot for boiling water to create steam, while the Henderson women gathered every clean cloth they could spare for fever management. The Williams wagon was converted into a makeshift hospital, with Dr. Williams directing the medical response while families reorganized their precious cargo to make room for emergency supplies. Jacob watched this mobilization with growing dread, knowing that the community's generous response would inevitably lead to an inventory of every wagon's contents and capabilities. In times of medical crisis, privacy became a luxury that frontier communities couldn't afford. Someone would need to check his wagon for supplies that might help Danny Morrison, and when that happened, 3 weeks of careful deception would crumble in an instant. Jacob, we need to assess what medical supplies and space are available in every wagon, Dr. Williams called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone managing a life-threatening emergency. Can you organize the wagon masters to do a complete inventory? We might need to redistribute people and supplies to create the best possible care environment. The request was perfectly reasonable and completely unavoidable. Jacob nodded his agreement while his mind raced through the implications of opening his wagon to inspection. Hope was currently sleeping in her makeshift crib, surrounded by the evidence of secret childcare that he had been hiding for weeks: bottles, diapers, infant clothing, and the distinctive smell of baby that no amount of ventilation had been able to eliminate completely. Thomas, Jacob said quietly, grabbing his second-in-command's arm as Dr. Williams moved on to coordinate other aspects of the medical response. I need you to handle the wagon inventory. Start with the families on the north side of the circle and work your way around. I'll take care of my own wagon personally. Thomas studied Jacob's face with the sharp attention of someone who understood that this moment was about more than medical supplies. Their earlier conversation about Hope's existence had prepared him for the crisis that Jacob was now facing, but Thomas's expression suggested he was beginning to comprehend the full magnitude of the deception that was about to be exposed. Jacob, Thomas said carefully, maybe it's time to trust the people who've been trusting you with their lives for the past 6 months. Before Jacob could respond, Martha Henderson approached with the bustling efficiency of someone who had taken charge of organizing the female response to the medical crisis. "Jacob, Dr. Williams needs to know what space might be available for isolating Danny if his condition worsens. Could you show me through your wagon so I can assess what might be rearranged?" The moment Jacob had been dreading for weeks had arrived with the inexorable force of the river current they would soon have to cross. Martha Henderson, with her maternal instincts and nursing experience, would immediately recognize the signs of infant care that filled his wagon. There was no way to refuse her request without raising suspicions that would make the eventual revelation even more damaging to his credibility as a leader. "Of course," Jacob heard himself saying, his voice sounding hollow and distant to his own ears. Let me go in first to check on Sarah." Martha nodded with understanding, assuming that Jacob needed to prepare his grieving wife for the intrusion of well-meaning neighbors. She had no way of knowing that Jacob was actually preparing to end a deception that had defined his family's existence for 3 weeks. Jacob climbed into his wagon with hands that trembled slightly, knowing that the next few minutes would transform his life in ways he couldn't predict or control. Hope was awake in her crib, making the soft cooing sounds that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Sarah lay on their bed, staring at the wagon's canvas ceiling with the same distant expression that had characterized her demeanor since the birth. "Sarah," Jacob said gently, settling beside her on the narrow bed, "we need to talk. The Morrison boy is seriously ill, and people are going to be coming through our wagon to assess what supplies and space we can contribute. They're going to see Hope." For the first time in days, Sarah's eyes focused on his face with something approaching genuine attention. "They'll see her?" she repeated, her voice carrying a note of panic that Jacob hadn't heard since the night of Hope's birth. "Martha Henderson is waiting outside," Jacob explained. "I can't keep refusing to let people help with a medical emergency. And even if I could, Thomas knows about Hope now, and Dr. Williams has been pushing me to tell the truth for weeks. The secret is over, Sarah. We have to face what comes next." Sarah sat up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate as she processed the implications of what Jacob was telling her. For 3 weeks, she had been able to avoid confronting the reality of their daughter's existence by maintaining the fiction that Hope was a private family matter. Now, suddenly, their private tragedy was about to become public knowledge. "What will they say?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with the fear that had been driving her withdrawal from community life. "What will they think of us, of her?" Jacob reached for her hand, finding it cold and trembling despite the wagon's stuffiness. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that hiding hasn't been working for any of us. Look at yourself, Sarah. Look at what this secret has done to you, to us, to our family." Before Sarah could respond, Martha Henderson's voice called from outside the wagon. "Jacob, is everything all right in there? Dr. Williams is asking about space availability, and we're trying to coordinate the best possible care for little Danny." Jacob looked at Hope, who was watching him with the serious expression that seemed so startling on such a young face. Her dark eyes held an alertness that suggested intelligence far beyond her 3 weeks of life, and for a moment he wondered what thoughts might be forming behind those eyes as she observed the adults who had been struggling with the fact of her existence. "We're coming, Martha," Jacob called back, his voice steadier than he felt. He looked at Sarah, who was staring at Hope with an expression that might have been fear or longing or something more complex than either. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah didn't answer immediately, but she reached toward Hope's crib with a hesitant hand that stopped just short of touching their daughter. "I've been so afraid," she whispered. Afraid of what people would think, afraid of what her life would be like, afraid of being judged for bringing a child into the world who would never be normal. "She's our daughter," Jacob said firmly, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "Whatever else she is or isn't, she's our daughter, and she deserves better than being treated like a shameful secret. Jacob lifted Hope from her crib, holding her against his chest as he had done countless times during the long nights when her crying had threatened to expose their deception. She settled against him with the trusting weight of a child who knew. She was safe in his arms, and for the first time since her birth, Jacob felt something approaching pride rather than fear when he looked at her face. "Martha," Jacob called, his voice carrying across the wagon. "Come in. There's something we need to show you." Martha Henderson climbed through the canvas opening with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing family crises, her eyes immediately scanning the wagon's interior for available space and useful supplies. Her gaze swept past the baby bottles and diapers that Jacob had tried to keep hidden, past the makeshift crib and infant clothing, before settling on Jacob himself as he stood holding Hope. The recognition dawned slowly across Martha's face first. Confusion as she processed the presence of a baby in a wagon where she expected to find a woman recovering from miscarriage, then understanding as she realized what she was actually seeing, and finally a complex mixture of emotions that included surprise, concern, and something that might have been relief. "Oh my," Martha said softly, her voice carrying none of the judgment or shock that Jacob had been fearing. "Oh my goodness, Jacob, she's beautiful." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they were so completely different from his own internal dialogue about Hope's appearance. Martha Henderson, experienced mother and unofficial midwife to the wagon train, was looking at his daughter and seeing beauty where he had been seeing only problems and complications. "Martha, I can explain," Jacob began, but Martha was already moving toward them with the confident stride of someone who had handled countless infant emergencies. "May I?" she asked, extending her arms toward Hope with the natural gesture of someone who understood that babies were meant to be held and admired, rather than hidden away like shameful secrets. Jacob hesitated for only a moment before placing Hope in Martha's experienced arms, watching as the older woman examined his daughter with the careful attention of someone assessing a child's health and development rather than cataloging deformities and limitations. "She's alert," Martha observed, noting the way Hope's eyes followed movement and sound. "Good color, good muscle tone. How has she been eating, sleeping? Any signs of colic or digestive problems?" The clinical questions were exactly what Jacob had been expecting from Dr. Williams, but coming from Martha, they felt different, less like medical assessment, and more like the kind of practical inquiry that one mother might make to another about childcare concerns. She's been doing well," Jacob admitted, realizing as he spoke that Hope had indeed been thriving despite the circumstances of her concealment. "Eating regularly, sleeping through most nights, no signs of illness or significant distress." "Of course she has," Martha said matter-of-factly. "She's got good parents who've been taking care of her needs." "Jacob, why on earth have you been keeping this precious child hidden away like she was something to be ashamed of?" The question was asked without accusation, but it carried the weight of genuine puzzlement from someone who couldn't understand why any family would hide a healthy baby from a community that would naturally want to help and celebrate new life. Jacob looked at Sarah, who was watching the interaction between Martha and Hope with an expression of wonder that suggested she was seeing her daughter clearly for the first time since the birth. The fear and shame that had dominated Sarah's response to motherhood seemed to be cracking under the influence of Martha's matter-of-fact acceptance of Hope as simply another baby who needed care and community support. "We were afraid," Sarah said quietly, speaking directly to Martha for the first time in weeks. "Afraid of what people would think about her her differences. Afraid that she would be seen as a burden rather than a blessing." Martha looked up from Hope with an expression of genuine surprise. "Differences? What differences?" "She's got all the important parts. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a healthy appetite, and parents who love her. What else matters?" It was then that Jacob realized Martha hadn't yet noticed Hope's physical deformities. Her attention focused on the baby's overall health and responsiveness rather than the specific anatomical variations that had consumed Jacob's thoughts for weeks. The shortened arm and twisted leg were hidden by the blanket, and the facial birthmark was less prominent when Hope was alert and active rather than crying or sleeping. But as Martha adjusted Hope's position to better support her head, the blanket shifted to reveal the shortened left arm that ended abruptly at the elbow. Martha's hands stilled for a moment as she processed this discovery, her expression growing more serious as she understood what Jacob and Sarah had been struggling with. "I see," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying a different quality now that she understood the full scope of the situation. "Now I understand why you've been so worried." Jacob braced himself for the change in Martha's attitude that he had been expecting, the shift from acceptance to pity, from celebration to awkward sympathy. But instead, Martha continued her examination of Hope with the same gentle competence she had shown before, her hands carefully assessing the baby's muscle tone and responsiveness without any visible change in her demeanor. "She's going to need some special considerations as she grows," Martha said eventually, her tone carrying the practical matter-of-factness that Jacob had always admired in her approach to family challenges. "But Jacob, she's a healthy, alert baby with parents who love her. That's more than many children have, and it's everything she needs to have a good life." The simple acceptance in Martha's voice broke something loose in Jacob's chest that had been locked tight since Hope's birth. For the first time in 3 weeks, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, his community would see his daughter as something other than a burden or a tragedy. Word spread through the Wagon circle with the swift efficiency that characterized all significant news on the trail. Within an hour of Martha Henderson's discovery, every family knew that Jacob and Sarah Mitchell had a living daughter, and that she had been hidden from the community for 3 weeks while they struggled with fears that now seemed as foreign to their neighbors as the distant mountains they were traveling toward. The response was unlike anything Jacob had imagined during his weeks of anxious speculation. Instead of judgment or whispered concerns about burden and liability, families began appearing at his wagon with the kind of practical support that had sustained them through cholera outbreaks, river crossings, and the countless daily challenges of trail life. Mrs. Patterson arrived with a basket of infant clothes that her own children had outgrown, explaining matter-of-factly that babies grew fast and parents needed all the help they could get. Williams' family contributed a wooden cradle that Dr. Williams had crafted during evening hours, originally intended as a gift for whichever family welcomed the next baby on the trail. "Should have known something was keeping you up nights," commented James Patterson as he helped carry supplies into the Mitchell wagon. "Man doesn't get those kind of dark circles under his eyes, just from worrying about river crossings and mountain passes. Babies will do that to you faster than anything else on earth." The casual acceptance in Patterson's voice revealed something that Jacob was only beginning to understand about the community he had been leading for 6 months. These weren't people who measured human worth by physical perfection or economic productivity. They were families who had left everything familiar behind to pursue dreams that required faith in things unseen, courage to face unknown challenges, and the understanding that survival depended on supporting each other through whatever circumstances arose. Samuel Henderson, now functioning as head of his household at 16, approached Jacob with the serious demeanor that grief and responsibility had etched into his young features. "Mr. Mitchell, sir, if you and Mrs. Mitchell need help with night feedings or infant care, my ma's raised 6 babies. She knows how to manage the schedule so parents can get some sleep." The offer was made with the same straightforward practicality that Samuel brought to wagon maintenance and livestock care, treating Hope's needs as simply another logistics challenge that the community could address through shared knowledge and coordinated effort. There was no pity in his voice, no awkward sympathy, just a recognition that babies required specific care that experienced people could provide more efficiently than exhausted parents, struggling alone. But it was the response of the children that surprised Jacob most profoundly. When the Patterson and Henderson youngsters gathered around Hope for their first glimpse of the baby who had been living among them in secret, their reactions were characterized by the unfiltered curiosity and acceptance that adults often lost in their concern for social conventions and polite responses. "She's so tiny," observed 8-year-old Lucy Patterson, reaching out to touch Hope's perfectly formed right hand with the gentle reverence that children reserved for things they considered precious. "Look how her fingers curl around mine when I touch her palm. Why does she have purple on her face?" asked Tommy Henderson, his 6-year-old directness addressing the birthmark that adults had been carefully avoiding mentioning. "It looks like someone painted flowers on her cheek." "Because that's how God made her special," replied his older sister Annie with the confident theology that 12-year-olds use to explain life's mysteries. "Mama says everyone gets born with something that makes them different from everyone else. Some people's differences just show on the outside where you can see them." Jacob listened to this exchange with growing amazement, realizing that the children were processing Hope's physical variations with the same matter-of-fact acceptance they brought to all the natural phenomena they encountered on the trail. To them, she was simply another baby to admire and protect, her differences no more troubling than the various eye colors, hair textures, and facial features that distinguished one child from another. The transformation in Sarah was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the community's response. As neighbors filled their wagon with gifts and offers of assistance, she began to emerge from the isolation that had characterized her behavior since Hope's birth. For the first time in weeks, Jacob heard her laugh, a soft sound triggered by Lucy Patterson's observation that Hope's tiny fingers were strong enough to be a good butter churner when she gets bigger. "She does have a strong grip," Sarah agreed, settling Hope more comfortably in her arms with movements that seemed natural, rather than fearful for the first time since the birth. "Dr. Williams says that's a sign of good muscle development and overall health." Jacob noticed that Sarah had begun speaking about Hope in the present tense, making plans and observations that suggested she was finally beginning to accept their daughter as a permanent part of their family rather than a temporary crisis to be endured. The change was subtle but profound, marking the beginning of Sarah's emergence from the grief and shame that had consumed her. For 3 weeks, the practical aspects of integrating Hope into the wagon train's daily routines proved surprisingly straightforward. Martha Henderson organized a rotation of experienced mothers who could assist with childcare during the challenging river crossing, ensuring that Hope's needs wouldn't interfere with the complex logistics of moving 47 wagons across dangerous water. Mrs. Williams volunteered to modify some of her husband's medical supplies to create better feeding bottles and infant care equipment, approaching Hope's special needs with the same innovative problem-solving that had sustained frontier families for generations. "We'll need to make some adjustments to your wagon's interior," suggested Thomas Bradley, who had been quietly observing the community's response to Hope's revelation. "Better ventilation for infant health, more secure storage for baby supplies. Maybe some modifications to make nighttime care easier during river crossings and mountain travel." The suggestions were offered with the same attention to detail that Thomas brought to all wagon train logistics, treating Hope's integration into trail life as an engineering challenge rather than an insurmountable obstacle. His practical approach helped Jacob understand that accommodating his daughter's needs didn't require abandoning their journey to Oregon. It simply required the kind of adaptive thinking that had enabled their community to survive every other challenge they had faced. But even as Jacob marveled at his neighbor's acceptance and support, he remained acutely aware that Hope's revelation had fundamentally altered his relationship with the people he led. The deception of the past 3 weeks couldn't be undone, and some families were clearly struggling to reconcile their trust in his judgment with the discovery that he had been lying to them about something as basic as his family's composition, Jacob. Dr. Williams approached as the initial flurry of neighborly support began to settle into a more sustainable pattern. Could we speak privately about the medical aspects of Hope's care during the remainder of our journey? The request was phrased diplomatically, but Jacob understood that Dr. Williams wanted to address the broader implications of his deception and its impact on community trust. They walked away from the wagon circle toward the river, where the sound of rushing water would provide privacy for a conversation that Jacob had been dreading since Martha Henderson's discovery. "I won't pretend I'm not disappointed," Dr. Williams began without preamble. "Not about Hope. She's a beautiful, healthy baby who deserves celebration rather than concealment. I'm disappointed that you felt you couldn't trust this community with the truth about your family." The words were spoken gently, but they carried the weight of legitimate concern about leadership and honesty that Jacob couldn't dismiss or deflect. Dr. Williams had earned the right to speak directly about these issues through his consistent service to the wagon train and his professional understanding of the medical realities involved. "I was afraid," Jacob admitted, the confession feeling both liberating and humiliating. Afraid of being seen as weak, afraid of burdening people who were already struggling with their own challenges, afraid that Hope's needs would compromise everyone's chances of reaching Oregon safely. "And now?" Dr. Williams asked. "After seeing how people have actually responded to learning about Hope, do those fears seem justified?" Jacob looked back toward the wagon circle, where he could see Hope being passed gently from one set of caring arms to another while Sarah received the kind of maternal support that she had been denying herself for weeks. The scene was so different from his darkest imaginings that it seemed to belong to an entirely different story. "No," Jacob said quietly, "my fears weren't justified. But Marcus, the damage from my deception might be harder to repair than I realized. Some of these families are questioning whether they can trust my judgment about anything if I was willing to lie about something this important." Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the legitimate concern that Jacob had raised. Trust, once broken, does require time and consistent action to rebuild. "But Jacob, these people have followed you across 2,000 miles of dangerous territory because they believe in your character and competence. One mistaken judgment, even a significant one, doesn't erase 6 months of proven leadership." The encouragement was welcome, but Jacob understood that rebuilding trust would require more than good intentions and community forgiveness. He would need to demonstrate through daily actions that his leadership could be relied upon even when personal challenges threatened to compromise his judgment. The conversation was interrupted by urgent voices from the direction of the wagon circle. Both men immediately recognized the tone of medical emergency and ran toward the commotion, their personal discussion forgotten in the face of potential crisis. They found Dr. Williams' wife Rebecca kneeling beside little Danny Morrison, whose condition had apparently taken a sudden turn for the worse. The child's breathing was labored and his fever had spiked, despite the careful nursing care he'd been receiving throughout the day. "His airway is closing," Rebecca Williams called to her husband as he approached. "The steam treatments aren't working anymore, and he's struggling for every breath." Dr. Williams immediately took charge of the medical crisis, his professional training overriding any personal concerns, as he assessed Danny's deteriorating condition. "We need to create a more humid environment and elevate his head to ease breathing. Martha, can you organize more steam? Mrs. Morrison, I need you to help keep him calm while I try some additional treatments." Jacob watched the coordinated response to Danny's crisis with a mixture of admiration and growing anxiety. The community's ability to mobilize resources and expertise for medical emergencies was impressive, but he could see that Dr. Williams was genuinely concerned about the child's chances of survival. "How long can we delay the river crossing?" Jacob asked Thomas quietly, both men understanding the implications of Danny's condition for their timeline and the entire wagon train's survival chances. "Weather's holding for now," Thomas replied, consulting the gray sky that had been threatening snow for days. "But Jacob, every day we delay increases the risk of being caught by winter storms in the mountain passes. We're already cutting it closer than any wagon master should." The harsh mathematics of frontier survival were reasserting themselves with cruel clarity. Danny Morrison's life hung in the balance, but so did the lives of nearly 200 other people who depended on reaching Oregon before winter made travel impossible. Once again, Jacob found himself facing the kind of impossible choice that frontier leadership demanded: individual welfare versus group survival, immediate compassion versus long-term responsibility. But as he watched his community rally around the Morrison family with the same generous spirit they had shown toward hope's revelation, Jacob began to understand something important about the nature of moral courage. Sometimes the right choice wasn't about calculating odds or managing resources efficiently. Sometimes it was about trusting that communities bound together by shared values could find ways to save everyone if they refused to accept that some people were expendable. The test of his leadership wouldn't be whether he could make the hard choices that frontier life demanded. The test would be whether he could inspire his community to believe that hard choices didn't have to mean abandoning anyone. Not Danny Morrison, not Hope Mitchell, not any of the nearly 200 souls who had entrusted their futures to his guidance. As night fell over the wagon circle and families settled into the routines of caring for both a critically ill child and a newly revealed baby, Jacob Mitchell prepared to discover whether leadership meant making impossible choices or finding the courage to refuse to accept that any choice was truly impossible. The second night brought an unexpected visitor to the wagon circle, announced not by the usual calls of sentries, but by a subtle change in the behavior of the livestock. The oxen grew restless, shifting nervously in their makeshift corral, while the horses lifted their heads with the alert attention that came from sensing human presence beyond the firelight's reach. Jacob, taking his turn at night watch while juggling the responsibilities of new fatherhood, noticed the animal's agitation before he spotted the lone figure approaching from the darkness of the prairie. The visitor materialized from the shadows like something conjured from the wilderness itself, an elderly Native American woman walking with the deliberate pace of someone who had traveled far but was in no hurry to complete her journey. She wore traditional clothing that marked her as Cheyenne, her silver hair braided with beads and feathers that caught the moonlight as she moved closer to the protective circle of wagons. Most remarkably, she approached alone, without the warrior escort or tribal delegation that usually accompanied Native encounters on the trail. Jacob's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle that never left his side during night watch, but something about the woman's demeanor made him hesitate. She walked without stealth or aggression, her posture conveying neither threat nor submission, but rather the kind of quiet authority that came from age, wisdom, and complete confidence in her own purposes. When she reached the edge of the firelight, she stopped and waited with the patience of someone who understood the protocols of respectful approach. "Who goes there?" Jacob called softly, not wanting to wake the camp, but needing to establish the nature of this unexpected encounter. Night visits from solitary travelers were rare enough to warrant careful attention, and native visitors often brought either opportunities for beneficial trade or warnings about dangers ahead. "I am Singing Crow," the woman replied in accented but clear English, her voice carrying the kind of dignified formality that suggested education or extensive contact with white settlers. "I come seeking the wagon master who leads these families toward the Sunset Lands." Jacob studied her carefully, noting the absence of weapons and the ceremonial rather than practical nature of her clothing. Singing Crow appeared to be well into her 60s, with the weathered features that came from a lifetime spent outdoors, and the kind of alert intelligence that suggested both wisdom and careful observation of her surroundings. "I'm Jacob Mitchell," he replied, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. What brings you to our camp in the middle of the night? Singing Crow's dark eyes studied Jacob with the same careful attention he was giving her, as if she were assessing something beyond his immediate appearance and demeanor. I come because the spirits have spoken of a child born under difficult stars, a child whose path will be different from others, but whose purpose may be greater than what mortal eyes can see. The words sent a chill through Jacob that had nothing to do with the October night air. The idea that word of hope's birth had somehow reached native communities beyond their trail was unsettling enough. But Singing Crow's phrasing suggested knowledge that went deeper than simple gossip or observation. I'm not sure what you've heard, Jacob said carefully, but we're just families traveling to Oregon Territory. Nothing more complicated than that. Singing Crow smiled with the kind of gentle patience that adults reserve for children who were trying to avoid acknowledging obvious truths. The child with the marked face and the incomplete limbs, she said matter-of-factly. The daughter whose father has been hiding her from those who would judge what they do not understand. I come to see this child because my dreams have shown me something important about her future. Jacob felt his carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of this impossible knowledge. How could a Cheyenne woman living in the wilderness know specific details about Hope's physical characteristics and his own struggles with accepting his daughter's differences? The implications were disturbing enough to make him wonder whether their wagon train had been under observation far longer than anyone had realized. My dreams do not lie, Jacob Mitchell, Singing Crow continued, apparently reading his confusion and concern. For 3 days, I have seen visions of a child who will become a bridge between worlds, a healer who will bring together different peoples through understanding that comes from having experienced rejection and found acceptance. Before Jacob could respond, the sound of crying began to emanate from his wagon, Hope's distinctive wail that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The timing seemed impossibly coincidental, as if his daughter were somehow aware of the conversation taking place outside and demanding to be included in whatever was unfolding. Singing Crow's expression changed subtly at the sound, her weathered features softening with something that might have been recognition or anticipation. She calls, the elderly woman said simply. May I see the child whose spirit has been speaking to mine in dreams? The request was so far outside Jacob's experience of native encounters that he found himself struggling to process what was being asked. Most interactions between wagon trains and native tribes involved trade negotiations, territorial discussions, or warnings about trail conditions ahead. He had never heard of a native elder requesting to examine a white settler's child based on spiritual visions or dreams, but something in Singing Crow's demeanor, the quiet dignity, the obvious lack of threat, the specific knowledge she possessed about his family situation, made Jacob find himself nodding agreement before his rational mind could object to the unprecedented nature of the encounter. Thomas, Jacob called softly to his second-in-command, who had emerged from his own wagon at the sound of voices. We have a visitor who wants to meet Hope. Thomas approached with the cautious alertness that characterized all his interactions with potentially dangerous situations. But like Jacob, he seemed to sense something in Singing Crow's presence that defied easy categorization as threatening or benign. She was simply there, waiting with the patient expectation of someone whose request would be honored, because it came from a place of spiritual authority rather than social convention. Ma'am, Thomas said politely, touching his hat brim in the gesture of respect that frontier courtesy demanded regardless of cultural differences. Thomas Bradley, second in command of this wagon train. Singing Crow acknowledged his introduction with a slight nod before returning her attention to Jacob. The child grows restless, she observed as Hope's crying intensified. She knows that something important is about to happen. Jacob led the small group toward his wagon, his mind racing through the implications of what he was about to do. Allowing a stranger, particularly a native stranger, to examine his newborn daughter, violated every protocol of trail safety and cultural caution that governed interactions between white settlers and indigenous peoples. But Singing Crow's knowledge of Hope's existence and condition suggested that normal protocols might not apply to whatever was unfolding. Inside the wagon, Sarah was attempting to soothe Hope's crying with the tired determination of a mother who had been managing infant care around the clock. She looked up in surprise as Jacob entered with two companions. Her expression shifted into alarm when she realized that one of their visitors was a native woman whose presence in their wagon represented something far outside her experience or expectations. "Sarah," Jacob said gently, "this is Singing Crow. She's come to meet Hope." Sarah's protective instincts flared immediately, her arms tightening around their daughter as she processed the unprecedented nature of what Jacob was suggesting. Like most white settlers, her understanding of native peoples was filtered through stories of conflict and kidnapping that made any request to examine her child seem potentially threatening. But Singing Crow approached with the same patient dignity she had shown outside, her movements slow and deliberate as she settled onto the wagon's floor with the fluid grace that came from a lifetime of adapting to various seating arrangements. Her presence seemed to fill the small space without overwhelming it, bringing a sense of calm authority that gradually began to affect even Hope's crying. "She is beautiful," Singing Crow said simply, her eyes fixed on Hope with the kind of intense attention that seemed to see beyond physical appearance to something deeper and more essential. The spirit spoke truly about her significance. As if responding to the sound of Singing Crow's voice, Hope's crying began to subside, replaced by the alert quiet that suggested she was processing new sensory information. Her dark eyes, so similar to her grandmother's but somehow more knowing, seemed to focus on the native woman's face with unusual concentration. "May I hold her?" Singing Crow asked, extending her arms with the confident expectation of someone who had handled countless infants throughout her lifetime. "There are things I need to understand about her spirit that can only be learned through touch." Sarah hesitated, her maternal instincts warring with curiosity about what this mysterious woman might reveal about her daughter. Finally, perhaps influenced by Hope's obvious calm and Singing Crow's presence, she carefully placed the baby in the elderly woman's experienced arms. What happened next would remain etched in Jacob's memory for the rest of his life. As Singing Crow settled Hope against her chest, the baby's demeanor changed completely from the restless fussiness that had characterized her behavior all evening to a profound stillness that seemed almost meditative. Her tiny hands, including the shortened left arm that Jacob still struggled to accept, reached towards Singing Crow's face with movements that seemed purposeful rather than random. Singing Crow began to hum a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, resonating through the wagon with vibrations that were felt as much as heard. The melody was unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced, neither the hymns of his Christian upbringing nor the folk songs that provided entertainment around evening campfires. It was something older and more primal, a sound that seemed to speak directly to parts of the human spirit that civilized society had forgotten existed. Hope's response to the humming was immediate and profound. Her entire body relaxed into complete calm, her breathing becoming deep and regular in a way that suggested she was entering the kind of peaceful sleep that had been elusive throughout her first 3 weeks of life. More remarkably, her physical differences, the foreshortened arm, the twisted leg, even the prominent birthmark seemed somehow less noticeable, as if Singing Crow's presence were allowing Hope's essential self to shine through the physical characteristics that had dominated everyone's perception of her. "She carries the mark of one who will walk between worlds," Singing Crow said softly, her voice barely audible over the continuing hum that seemed to emanate from her chest without conscious effort. "The shortened arm speaks of learning to accomplish great things with limited resources. The marked face tells of beauty that will be recognized by those who see with hearts rather than eyes." The twisted leg prophesies a path that will be different from others, but will lead to destinations that straight paths cannot reach. Jacob felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to Singing Crow's interpretation of his daughter's physical differences. For 3 weeks, he had seen only limitations and challenges, obstacles that would prevent Hope from living a normal frontier life. But through Singing Crow's words, those same characteristics were being transformed into prophecies of unique purpose and spiritual significance. "What does it mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she watched her daughter rest in perfect peace for the first time since her birth. "What is she meant to become?" Singing Crow continued her humming for several more minutes, before responding, her eyes never leaving Hope's serene face. "She will be a healer," the elderly woman said finally, her voice carrying the certainty of absolute conviction. "Not of bodies, though she may learn those arts as well, but of the divisions that separate peoples who should walk together in harmony. Her differences will teach her compassion for all who suffer from being judged by appearances rather than souls." The prophecy hung in the wagon's warm air like incense, transforming the space from a simple traveling shelter into something approaching a sacred sanctuary. Jacob felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of his daughter's purpose, his fears about her limitations, being replaced by wonder at possibilities he had never imagined. "The spirits have one more message," Singing Crow said, her humming gradually fading as Hope settled into the deepest sleep she had experienced since birth. "This child's path will not be easy, but it will be blessed. Those who support her journey will find their own lives enriched in ways they cannot foresee. Those who reject or abandon her will discover that they have lost something precious that cannot be replaced." With infinite gentleness, Singing Crow placed Hope back in Sarah's arms, the transfer accomplished so smoothly that the baby never stirred from her peaceful slumber. The elderly Cheyenne woman rose with the same fluid grace she had displayed throughout the encounter, her mission apparently complete. "I must return to my people now," Singing Crow announced, moving toward the wagon's entrance with the decisive movement of someone whose purpose had been fulfilled. "But Jacob Mitchell, remember what you have witnessed tonight. Your daughter is not a burden to be hidden or a problem to be solved. She is a gift whose purpose will unfold in its proper time." As Singing Crow prepared to disappear back into the prairie darkness from which she had emerged, Jacob found his voice for one final question. "How did you know about her? How did you find us?" Singing Crow paused at the wagon's entrance, her weathered face illuminated by the dying embers of the campfire. "The spirits speak to those who know how to listen," she replied simply. "And some children are born with destinies so significant that their presence echoes across great distances to those who are meant to help guide their paths." With that cryptic explanation, she vanished into the night as silently as she had appeared, leaving behind a family forever changed by an encounter that defied every assumption they had held about their daughter's future and their own understanding of the spiritual forces that shaped human destiny. Dawn broke clear and cold over the wagon circle, revealing a landscape transformed not by weather, but by the profound shift in perspective that Singing Crow's visit had brought to the Mitchell family and gradually to the entire community. Word of the mysterious Cheyenne elder's nocturnal visit spread through the wagons with the same efficiency that had characterized news of Hope's revelation. But this time the conversations carried undertones of awe and spiritual wonder rather than practical concern. Jacob found himself fielding questions that he couldn't adequately answer. How had Singing Crow known about Hope's existence and specific condition? What did her prophecies mean for the child's future and the family's journey to Oregon? Most challenging of all, how should a community of Christian settlers process spiritual guidance that came from outside their familiar religious framework? "Never seen anything like it," admitted Reverend Joshua Coleman, the Methodist minister who had been providing spiritual leadership to the wagon train since their departure from Independence. "That child slept through the night for the first time since her birth, and Sarah looks like she's been touched by divine grace. But Jacob, I'm struggling to understand how to interpret guidance that comes from pagan sources. The conversation was taking place beside the Sweetwater River, where advance teams had been working since before dawn to prepare for the dangerous crossing that could no longer be delayed. Danny Morrison's condition had stabilized overnight, another unexpected development that some families were attributing to the same spiritual forces that had brought Singing Crow to their camp. "Reverend, I'm not asking you to change your theology," Jacob replied carefully, understanding that Coleman's concerns reflected those of many families who were trying to reconcile their Christian faith with the undeniable impact of Singing Crow's visit. "But I can't ignore what happened in our wagon last night. That woman knew things about hope that no human observer could have learned through natural means." Coleman nodded thoughtfully, his expression reflecting the internal struggle of a man whose theological training hadn't prepared him for encounters that fell outside conventional Christian experience. "Perhaps," he said finally, "we need to consider that God's grace might work through vessels that don't fit our expectations. After all, didn't the Lord use foreign kings and pagan nations to accomplish his purposes in the Old Testament?" The theological flexibility that Coleman was demonstrating would prove crucial in helping the wagon train process would have become a defining moment in their collective journey. Rather than dismissing Singing Crow's visit as demonic deception or primitive superstition, the minister was choosing to interpret it as evidence of divine providence working through unexpected channels. This inclusive approach was particularly important for Sarah, whose transformation since the Cheyenne elder's visit had been nothing short of miraculous. The withdrawn, grief-stricken woman who had barely acknowledged hope's existence for 3 weeks had been replaced by someone who radiated the kind of quiet confidence that came from absolute certainty about her daughter's value and purpose. "She's not broken," Sarah announced to Martha Henderson as they prepared Hope for the day's travel, her voice carrying conviction that hadn't been present since the birth. "All this time I thought God had cursed us with a damaged child, but Singing Crow helped me understand that Hope was blessed with differences that will allow her to accomplish things that ordinary children couldn't." Martha smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose faith had always included room for mystery and wonder. "Honey, some of us knew from the first moment we saw her that Hope was special. It just took the right messenger to help you see what was already there." The river crossing began at mid-morning, with the systematic precision that had characterized all of the wagon train's major challenges. The Sweetwater was running high and fast, but the advance teams had identified a ford where the water depth wouldn't exceed the wagon beds and the bottom was solid enough to support the weight of loaded oxen teams. The key to success lay in maintaining steady progress without allowing any wagon to stall in the current or veer from the marked route. Jacob positioned himself at the river's edge to coordinate the crossing, but he found his attention repeatedly drawn to his own wagon, where Sarah sat holding Hope with the serene confidence of a mother who no longer questioned her child's place in the world. The transformation was so complete that even Hope seemed different, alert and calm, instead of the restless fussiness that had characterized her behavior before Singing Crow's visit. "Mitchell Wagon," called James Patterson, who was serving as crossing coordinator. "You're up next." Jacob climbed onto the wagon seat beside Sarah, taking the reins of their oxen team while trying to ignore the symbolic significance of this moment. The river crossing would be Hope's first major test as an acknowledged member of the wagon train community, her first participation in the kind of shared challenge that defined frontier life. The oxen entered the water with the patient determination that had carried them across 2,000 miles of difficult terrain. The current was strong enough to push against the wagon sides, but the animals maintained their footing on the rocky bottom, while Jacob kept them moving at the steady pace that prevented stalling or loss of control. Halfway across, disaster struck not to the Mitchell wagon, but to the Henderson family, whose wagon had entered the water directly behind them. One of their oxen stumbled on the uneven bottom, causing the wagon to lurch sideways toward deeper water, where the current could sweep it downstream. "Hold on," shouted Samuel Henderson, fighting to regain control of his team while his mother and sisters clung to the wagon sides. But the current was too strong, and the wagon began sliding toward water that would be deep enough to flood their supplies and potentially drown anyone who couldn't swim. Without hesitation, Jacob handed the reins to Sarah and dove into the river, fighting the current to reach the Henderson wagon before it could be swept into the deeper channel. The water was shockingly cold, but adrenaline carried him forward until he could grab the oxen's harness and add his strength to Samuel's efforts to guide the team back toward solid footing. Thomas Bradley and 2 other men quickly joined the rescue effort, their combined strength finally succeeding in pulling the Henderson wagon back onto the safe route. But the incident had consumed precious time and energy, and several families still waited to make the crossing before the days. Light began to fade. "Everyone all right?" Jacob called out, checking on the Henderson family while water streamed from his soaked clothes. "We're fine," Martha Henderson replied, though her voice carried the shakiness that followed close calls with disaster. "Thanks to you and the other men." Samuel did everything right, but sometimes the river just decides to test you. As the crossing resumed with heightened caution, Jacob found himself thinking about Singing Crow's prophecy concerning Hope's destiny as a healer of divisions between peoples. The rescue of the Henderson wagon had required exactly the kind of cooperation and mutual support that the Cheyenne elder had described. People from different backgrounds working together to ensure that no one was abandoned to face danger alone. Parallel became even more apparent when Danny Morrison's condition took another turn for the better during the afternoon's travel. Dr. Williams confirmed that the child's fever had broken completely and his breathing had returned to normal, marking a recovery so rapid and complete that it defied medical explanation. "I've seen croup before," Dr. Williams confided to Jacob during their evening camp setup. "Children can recover quickly, but Danny's improvement is remarkable even by optimistic standards. His mother swears the change began right around the time that Cheyenne woman visited your wagon." The implication was clear, though Dr. Williams was too scientifically trained to attribute Danny's recovery directly to spiritual intervention. Still, the timing was impossible to ignore, and families throughout the wagon train were beginning to whisper about connections between Singing Crow's visit and the sudden resolution of multiple crises that had been threatening their journey. Perhaps the most significant development was the change in how the children of the wagon train were responding to hope. Led by Lucy Patterson's enthusiastic acceptance, the young people had begun treating hope not as a curiosity or object of pity, but as something approaching a good luck charm or blessing that had brought positive changes to their entire community. "She's magic," announced 6-year-old Tommy Henderson with the absolute conviction that children reserve for matters of ultimate importance. "Ever since she stopped being secret, everything's been getting better. Danny's not sick anymore. The river crossing worked even when our wagon almost got washed away, and my ma stops crying about pay when she holds baby Hope." The innocent observation contained more wisdom than Tommy could have understood. Hope's emergence from secrecy had indeed coincided with a series of positive developments that were helping to heal various wounds and divisions within the wagon train community. Whether these improvements were coincidental, spiritually influenced, or simply the result of honest communication replacing fearful deception, the effect was undeniably beneficial. As evening settled over their successful river crossing, families gathered around cooking fires to share the day's experiences and plan for the final push toward Oregon territory. The mood was notably different from previous evening gatherings, more hopeful, more unified, characterized by the kind of mutual support that had always existed, but had somehow become more intentional and visible since Hope's revelation. Jacob found himself holding his daughter while Sarah helped prepare their evening meal, marveling at how natural the scene felt after weeks of treating Hope's existence as a shameful burden. The baby was alert and content, her dark eyes taking in the sounds and sights of camp life with the intense curiosity that suggested intelligence far beyond her 3 weeks of age. "You know what I think?" Sarah said as she stirred beans over their campfire, her voice carrying the conversational tone that had been absent from their marriage since Hope's birth. "I think Singing Crow was right about Hope being meant to bring people together. Look around, Jacob. When's the last time you've seen families cooperating this willingly, this generously?" Jacob surveyed the wagon circle, noting the numerous instances of spontaneous mutual aid that were taking place without formal organization or request. The Williams family was sharing medical supplies with the Morrisons. The Patterson children were helping elderly Mrs. Foster with her evening chores, and Samuel Henderson was assisting with wagon repairs that would benefit multiple families. "It's like everyone remembered that we're all in this together," Jacob agreed, bouncing Hope gently as she began to fuss in the way that indicated hunger rather than distress. Maybe that's what Singing Crow meant about Hope being a healer, not that she would cure physical ailments, but that her presence would remind people about the spiritual connections that make communities stronger. The observation was interrupted by an unexpected development that would test the wagon train's newfound unity in ways they couldn't have anticipated. A group of riders was approaching from the east, not the single mysterious visitor they had encountered the previous night, but what appeared to be a large party of mounted men whose intentions were impossible to determine in the gathering darkness. "Riders! Coming!" called out the sentry, his voice carrying the alert tone that brought every adult in the camp to immediate attention. "Looks like maybe 20 or 30 men, approaching from downriver." Jacob handed Hope to Sarah and moved quickly toward his rifle, the domestic tranquility of their evening routine instantly replaced by the planva, survival instincts that governed all interactions with unknown parties on the frontier. The timing was particularly unfortunate, coming just as the wagon train had completed a difficult river crossing and was camped in a position that offered limited defensive advantages. But as the riders drew closer, their leader raised his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful approach, and Jacob recognized the distinctive clothing and equipment that marked them as U.S. Army cavalry rather than hostile forces or bandits. "Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Mitchell, 4th Cavalry Regiment," announced the lead rider as he approached the wagon circle's defensive perimeter. "We're looking for a wagon train led by Jacob Mitchell. Understand, there might be some family connection there." Jacob felt a shock of recognition that went far beyond the shared surname. The man addressing him bore facial features that were unmistakably familiar, though aged and weathered by military service and frontier life. After more than 15 years of separation, Jacob was looking at his older brother William, who had left Missouri to pursue a military career and had never returned to visit the family farm. The reunion that followed would bring new complications and opportunities to a journey that had already been transformed by revelations about faith, family, and the mysterious ways that destiny could unfold through the most unexpected encounters. But as Jacob stared at his brother's familiar face, he couldn't help but wonder whether Singing Crow's prophecies about Hope's role as a bridge between worlds might extend to healing divisions that went deeper than anyone had imagined. The reunion between the Mitchell brothers unfolded against the backdrop of a frontier night that seemed charged with significance beyond the immediate surprise of family reconnection. Lieutenant Colonel William Mitchell dismounted with the practiced efficiency of a career cavalry officer, but his weathered features softened with genuine emotion as he approached the brother he hadn't seen in 15 years. "Jacob," William said, his voice carrying the complex mixture of affection and uncertainty that characterized long-separated siblings. "When we received reports about a wagon train led by a Jacob Mitchell, I had to investigate. Never imagined I'd find my little brother leading families to Oregon Territory." Jacob found himself studying William's face, noting how military life had carved lines of authority and responsibility that mirrored his own experiences as wagon master. Both men had chosen leadership roles that required making difficult decisions about other people's welfare, though their paths had diverged dramatically since their shared childhood on the Missouri farm. "William," Jacob replied, extending his hand before thinking better of the formal gesture and pulling his brother into an embrace that bridged 15 years of separation. "What brings the 4th Cavalry to the middle of nowhere? We haven't seen military patrols this far west." William's expression grew more serious as he glanced around the wagon circle, noting the defensive positioning and the alert faces of families who had learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors. "We've been tracking a band of Lakota warriors who raided a settlement near Fort Laramie. Lost the trail 2 days ago, but our Cheyenne scouts reported unusual spiritual activity in this area. Something about a sacred child and prophecies that could affect relations between the tribes and white settlers." The mention of Cheyenne scouts and spiritual activity sent a chill through Jacob as he realized that Singing Crow's visit had implications far beyond his family's personal transformation. If military forces were investigating Native American spiritual movements, Hope's prophesied role as a bridge between worlds might carry political and cultural significance that Jacob hadn't fully understood. "Spiritual activity?" Jacob asked carefully, unwilling to reveal too much until he understood his brother's intentions and the military's interest in their wagon train. William's eyes narrowed with the keen observation skills that had made him successful in frontier military service. "Don't play innocent, Jacob. My scouts described a Cheyenne medicine woman visiting a wagon train at this exact location, performing some kind of ceremony involving a white child with distinctive physical characteristics. They seemed to think this encounter was significant enough to report to tribal elders across multiple nations." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's approach, carrying Hope with the confident maternal posture that had replaced her previous anxiety and shame. She had clearly heard enough of the discussion to understand that their daughter was once again at the center of complex circumstances beyond their immediate control. "Jacob," Sarah said quietly, "is there something we need to know about Hope's safety? If military forces are involved, maybe we should understand what we're facing." William's attention immediately focused on Hope, his military bearing softening as he processed what he was seeing. Jacob watched his brother's face change as he took in Hope's alert expression, her physical differences, and the unmistakable aura of intelligence and awareness that seemed to radiate from such a young child. "This is your daughter," William said, his voice carrying wonder rather than the clinical assessment Jacob had been fearing. "The child the Cheyenne scouts described as bearing the mark of prophecy." "This is Hope Mitchell," Jacob said firmly, using their daughter's full name as a declaration of family pride rather than defensive identification. "Born 3 weeks ago and already changing lives in ways I'm only beginning to understand." William studied Hope with the careful attention of someone trained to assess potential threats and opportunities, but his expression revealed growing fascination rather than concern. "The scouts said she was born with signs that their spiritual leaders interpret as indicating a bridge between worlds, someone destined to heal divisions between peoples who have been enemies." "That's what Singing Crow told us," Sarah confirmed, her voice steady despite the implications of military interest in their daughter. "She said Hope would become a healer, not of bodies but of the separations that keep different peoples from understanding each other." William was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing information that challenged his military training and frontier experience. "Sarah, Jacob, what I'm about to tell you could change everything about your journey to Oregon Territory. The Indian Bureau has been seeking someone who could serve as a cultural intermediary, someone trusted by both white settlers and native tribes who could help negotiate peaceful coexistence instead of the constant warfare that's been devastating both communities." Jacob felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders as he recognized the approach of another impossible choice between personal desires and larger responsibilities. William, Hope is 3 weeks old. Whatever role she might play in the future, right now she's just a baby who needs to reach Oregon territory safely with her family. Of course, William agreed immediately. But Jacob, the Cheyenne Scouts weren't just reporting spiritual curiosity. Multiple tribes are sending delegations to witness what they consider a significant prophetic fulfillment. Your wagon train is about to become the center of attention from Native nations who rarely cooperate with each other, but who apparently agree about your daughter's importance. The implications were staggering. Instead of the quiet family journey to Oregon that Jacob had been planning, they were apparently destined to become involved in cultural negotiations that could affect the entire future of Western expansion and Native American relations. But before Jacob could respond to his brother's revelations, commotion erupted from the direction of the Morrison wagon. Dr. Williams was calling for assistance, his voice carrying the urgency that indicated a medical emergency requiring immediate community response. All 3 adults immediately moved toward the crisis, their family reunion temporarily forgotten in the face of someone's immediate need. They found Danny Morrison sitting up in his mother's arms, but instead of the medical emergency they had expected, the scene was one of celebration and wonder. "He's talking," Mrs. Morrison announced, tears of joy streaming down her face. For the first time since his illness began, Danny's talking in complete sentences and asking for food. Dr. Williams says his recovery is complete. Dr. Williams looked up from his examination with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with puzzled amazement. His fever broke completely, his breathing is normal, and his energy has returned to levels that suggest he was never seriously ill. Medically speaking, this kind of recovery is possible but highly unusual. Young Danny Morrison chose that moment to notice Hope in Sarah's arms, pointing toward the baby with the excited enthusiasm of a child who had discovered something wonderful. "Pretty baby," he announced loudly enough for half the wagon circle to hear. "She made me feel better when she was crying yesterday. Her crying sounded like singing that helped me sleep." The innocent observation from a 3-year-old carried implications that none of the adults were prepared to process. Danny was claiming that Hope's presence had somehow contributed to his recovery, that her crying, which had been a source of anxiety for Jacob during weeks of concealment, had actually provided comfort and healing to another child in crisis. Martha Henderson, who had been helping care for Danny during his illness, nodded thoughtfully at the boy's words. Come to think of it, Danny's condition did start improving right around the time we learned about Hope's existence. The timing was so close that I wondered if there might be a connection. William Mitchell was taking notes in a small leather journal, his military training having taught him to document unusual occurrences that might have strategic significance. "Jacob, what my scouts reported is starting to make more sense. If this child genuinely possesses some kind of healing influence, her importance to tribal spiritual leaders would be enormous." But the most significant response came from Hope herself. As if recognizing that she was the center of attention and discussion, she began making soft cooing sounds that seemed almost musical in their complexity and rhythm. The sounds were unlike the random vocalizations typical of newborn babies. They seemed purposeful, almost communicative, as if Hope were trying to participate in the conversation about her own destiny. Reverend Coleman, who had been observing the scene with the theological fascination that had characterized his response to all the spiritual developments surrounding Hope, stepped forward with an expression of profound wonder. "I've been a minister for 23 years, he said quietly, "and I've never witnessed anything quite like this. This child seems to be a conduit for healing and reconciliation in ways that transcend any single religious tradition." The various families of the wagon train had gradually gathered around the Morrison wagon, drawn by the commotion but remaining to witness what was clearly becoming another significant moment in Hope's brief but already remarkable life. The children, led by Lucy Patterson and Tommy Henderson, pressed closer with the fearless curiosity that adults had learned to suppress in favor of caution and social convention. "Can I hold her?" asked Lucy, reaching toward Hope with the confident expectation of someone who had already been accepted into the baby circle of trusted companions. "I want to see if she makes the happy sounds when I hold her too." Sarah looked at Jacob, who nodded his permission for what had become a community ritual, the passing of Hope among the Wagon train's children, who seemed to understand something about her significance that the adults were still struggling to comprehend. As Lucy took Hope in her 8-year-old arms, with the careful competence that frontier children developed early, the baby settled into immediate contentment, her dark eyes focusing on Lucy's face with the kind of attention that suggested genuine recognition and trust. "She knows me," Lucy announced with the matter-of-fact certainty that children brought to observations that adults would qualify with uncertainty. "She knows all of us. That's why she stopped being fussy when she stopped being a secret. Because babies need to know who their family is, and we're all her family now." The simple wisdom in Lucy's words provided clarity that had been missing from all the adult discussions about prophecy, cultural significance, and political implications. Hope's transformation from hidden burden to beloved community member had paralleled the Wagon train's evolution from a collection of individual families into something approaching an extended kinship network. William Mitchell closed his journal and looked at his brother with an expression that mixed military assessment with genuine admiration. "Jacob, what you've accomplished here goes beyond successful Wagon train leadership. You've created a community that can adapt to unexpected circumstances and find strength in diversity rather than seeing it as weakness." "I didn't create anything," Jacob replied, looking around at the faces of people who had become far more than traveling companions. "We discovered something that was already there, the capacity to care for each other regardless of differences or difficulties." As if to underscore his point, Hope began making her musical sounds again, but this time other children joined in, creating a spontaneous harmony that seemed to encompass the entire Wagon circle. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, transcending cultural and religious boundaries to touch something universal about human connection and shared purpose. Singing Crow emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight, her reappearance as unexpected as her initial visit, but somehow inevitable given the significance of what was unfolding. This time she was not alone. 3 other Native American elders accompanied her, representing different tribes but united in their apparent interest in witnessing Hope's continuing development. "The prophecy unfolds as foretold," Singing Crow announced, her voice carrying across the Wagon circle with the authority of someone speaking on behalf of spiritual forces beyond immediate understanding. "The child who will bridge worlds has begun her work, bringing healing to divisions that have separated peoples for generations." She approached Hope, who was now being held by Tommy Henderson while the other children continued their impromptu musical accompaniment to her vocalizations. But the greatest test still lies ahead. The child's family must choose whether to accept the responsibility that comes with such gifts, or to seek the easier path of ordinary life in distant territories. Jacob felt the weight of decision settling on him once again. But this time the choice was different from his previous struggles with shame and fear about Hope's differences. This was about accepting a destiny that would require courage, sacrifice, and faith in purposes larger than individual family welfare. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Jacob said, addressing not just Singing Crow but the assembled representatives of different communities who were somehow united in their interest in his daughter's future. "Remain here," William Mitchell said, speaking with the authority of someone who had been granted permission to make official offers. "Establish a permanent settlement that could serve as a meeting place between white settlers and native tribes. Use Hope's unique gifts to facilitate understanding and cooperation, instead of the warfare that has been destroying both communities." The proposal was staggering in its implications. Instead of completing their journey to Oregon Territory, Jacob was being asked to abandon his original dreams in favor of a purpose he hadn't chosen, but couldn't deny. Sarah stepped forward, holding Hope with the confident maternal authority that had replaced her previous fear and shame. This isn't just about our family anymore, is it? Hope's gifts come with responsibilities that affect more people than we ever imagined. Singing Crow nodded approvingly at Sarah's understanding. The child who walks between worlds must have parents who understand that some purposes are larger than personal desires. But such purposes also bring blessings that exceed individual dreams. As dawn broke over the Wagon circle, revealing a landscape that seemed transformed by the night's revelations, Jacob found himself facing a choice that would define not just his family's future, but potentially the relationship between cultures that had been locked in conflict since first contact. Looking at Hope, who was regarding him with eyes that seemed far too knowing for a 3-week-old baby, Jacob understood that his daughter's destiny had been calling to him since her birth. His fear and shame had prevented him from recognizing that her differences weren't limitations to be hidden but gifts to be celebrated and shared. "We'll stay," Jacob announced, his voice carrying the conviction that came from finally understanding his purpose. "We'll establish a settlement here and help Hope fulfill whatever destiny she's meant to embrace." The decision was met with approval from unexpected quarters, not just the Native American elders and his military brother, but from the families of the Wagon train who had been transformed by their journey from strangers into something approaching an extended family. "Count us in," announced Thomas Bradley, speaking for multiple families who nodded their agreement. "We came west looking for new opportunities, and this seems like the greatest opportunity any of us could have imagined being part of something that could change the entire relationship between different people." 5 years later, the settlement of Hope's Crossing had become a model for peaceful coexistence between white settlers and multiple Native American tribes. Hope Mitchell, now able to walk despite her physical differences and communicate in ways that transcended language barriers, served as the symbolic and practical center of a community that had attracted attention from government officials, religious leaders, and anyone interested in alternatives to warfare and cultural conflict. Jacob Mitchell, no longer a wagon master but now a town leader and cultural mediator, often reflected on the journey that had begun with shame about his daughter's differences and had evolved into celebration of the gifts that came from embracing, rather than hiding, what made people unique. Hope's Crossing stood as proof that Singing Crow's prophecies had been fulfilled, not through magic or supernatural intervention, but through the simple recognition that communities could become stronger by including rather than excluding those who were different. And in the center of it all, Hope Mitchell continued to grow into her destiny as a bridge between worlds, demonstrating daily that the greatest healers were often those who had experienced rejection and had chosen to respond with love rather than bitterness. The Wagon Master's daughter, born deformed and nearly abandoned, had indeed found her gift, not despite her differences, but because of them, teaching everyone around her that true healing came from accepting and celebrating the full spectrum of human diversity. As Singing Crow had prophesied, Hope's differences had become the foundation for a new kind of community, where physical limitations were transformed into spiritual strengths, and where the courage to embrace the unexpected could create possibilities that exceeded anyone's original dreams. The circle was complete. From fear to acceptance, from isolation to community, from seeing differences as burdens to recognizing them as blessings that could heal not just individuals, but entire cultures ready to learn that diversity was not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be celebrated. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.